Okay, so picture this. We are about to dive into one of the most chilling, absolutely captivating historical mysteries of the entire 20th century. In this explainer, we're going to be using strictly verified facts to try and piece together a puzzle that has literally baffled investigators for decades. We're talking, of course, about the Dyatlov Pass Incident. Right off the bat, we have to ask the main question that drives this whole bizarre story. What on earth terrified 9 highly experienced hikers so much that they cut their tent open from the inside and ran out into a freezing, unforgiving night? Honestly, it defies all logic. It goes against every single ounce of mountain survival training. So to really understand how this happened, we first have to understand exactly who these people were and the world they lived in. Which brings us to Section 1, the 1959 Soviet context. Now, we really can't view this incident through a modern lens. It just doesn't work. Back in 1959, in the post-Stalin Soviet Union, mountaineering wasn't just some casual weekend hobby that you did for fun. It was a massive deal. It was deeply tied to state-sponsored prestige. Pushing your physical limits in these extreme environments was actually a way to demonstrate socialist endurance and capability to the world. And they specifically chose the Ural Mountains, a region famously known for its brutal, almost total isolation, because this route was literally designed to test the absolute limits of human endurance. It was a badge of honor. As you can see from this breakdown, led by Igor Dyatlov, these were not just careless amateurs who accidentally wandered into a bad storm. No way. This team was highly experienced in winter expeditions, and they were actively seeking a top-tier certification. They knew the snow, they knew the bitter cold, and they knew exactly how to survive in it. Actually, it's their incredibly high level of expertise that makes their ultimate fate so tragic and perplexing. Let's move on to Section 2, Journey to Dead Mountain. So their travel begins completely normally, but they very quickly run into incredibly deep snow and really severe mountain conditions. I mean, picture this cinematic winter atmosphere for a second. Thick, volumetric fog is rolling in, heavy snowstorms are reducing visibility to almost nothing. It's basically a whiteout. Yet, they push forward. They meticulously prepare their camp, and they're even documenting their journey, taking these final, hauntingly normal photographs along the way. And before the disaster strikes, reading their final diary entries really humanizes this group. They document the sheer physical toll of trudging through that deep snow, yet they maintain this amazing camaraderie. Reading their own words builds this eerie intimacy, you know? They were just regular young people, super ambitious, fully alive, and completely unaware of what was waiting for them out there in the dark. That takes us to Section 3, the final camp. So they end up pitching their tent on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl. Now, in the local indigenous language, that translates ominously to Dead Mountain, which, pretty much perfectly captures the stark, freezing reality of their final camp. They were totally alone on this barren slope, just completely exposed to the elements.
Which leads us to Section 4, the bizarre discovery.
Okay, so weeks go by with absolutely no communication. Nothing. When search teams are finally dispatched, they uncover a terrifying sequence of events. First, they locate the partially collapsed abandoned tent. But then, and this is the part that changes the whole shebang, they realize the tent wasn't ripped open by the wind. It was sliced open, from the inside. The hikers literally cut their way out of their own shelter. And inside, investigators find the team's heavy winter boots and gear left perfectly behind, just sitting there. Then, leading away from the tent, straight down the mountain, they find barefoot tracks in the snow. Just think about that. Something frightened them so completely that escaping into the deadly cold without shoes was somehow their better option. Finally, Section 5, an unresolved mystery. The tragic reality of their final hours is just incredibly grim. The first victims were found at the edge of the forest, huddled near the remains of this desperate makeshift fire beneath a large cedar tree. The rest of the victims were found scattered further away, with some seemingly attempting to crawl back up the mountain toward the tent. It really highlights the absolute desperation of their fragmented actions in the dark. Now, in this explainer, separating fact from internet lore is absolutely crucial. The verified findings of the official investigation confirm the locations of the bodies, the state of the tent, and the absolute lack of a plausible, singular explanation that fits all this evidence. We aren't inventing evidence or entertaining wild theories here. This is simply the stark, documented reality that the Soviet investigators found on that mountain. And to truly grasp the extremity of the conditions they fled into, consider the temperature that night, -25 degrees Celsius. That is brutal, biting, immediate cold. To put that into perspective, without proper gear, exposure at this temperature is fatal in a matter of hours, if not literal minutes. So this leaves us with a massive paradox that defies nature and survival instincts alike. Why would heavily experienced, state-trained winter hikers intentionally leave their only shelter, abandoning their boots and vital gear, in temperatures plunging below -25 degrees Celsius? What do you think forced them out into the dark? Keep this question in mind, because the shadows on Dead Mountain haven't given up all their secrets just yet. Picture this. It's 1959, and 9 highly experienced hikers vanish into the freezing Soviet mountains. When searchers finally tracked them down, the scene they found was so bizarre, so genuinely horrifying, that the lead investigator quietly resigned and the files were locked away in secret archives for decades. Today, we're cutting through all the paranormal noise. We're going to look strictly at the cold, hard evidence, the major theories, and the latest modern science to finally decode the Dyatlov Pass Incident. So what actually happened out there? This is the core question that has baffled investigators for over 60 years. 9 seasoned survivalists go in, 0 come out. But it's the campsite that really captures everyone's attention. I mean, what kind of terrifying force would make a group of expert hikers literally slash their way out of their own tent from the inside? Why would they flee into a pitch-black winter night in nothing but their socks and underwear in -22-degree weather? All right, let's start by establishing the facts with Section 1, the incident recap. On paper, this timeline looks pretty straightforward. Late January 1959, the hikers head out. Sometime in early February, disaster strikes, and the tent is slashed open. By late February, the first frozen bodies are found. But it wasn't until May that the final bodies were discovered deep in a ravine. Here's where things get really weird, though. The bodies were scattered over a mile away from the camp, and some had catastrophic injuries, trauma you'd expect from a high-speed car crash, not a snowstorm. That completely shattered any easy explanations. Which brings us to Section 2, evaluating the major theories. Because the initial evidence was just so confusing, people came up with some wildly different hypotheses. The most prominent natural theories involved extreme weather, specifically sudden avalanches or something called katabatic winds. Imagine a severe hurricane-force wall of high-density wind that just unexpectedly plunges down a mountain slope. You've got an instantaneous temperature drop combined with a physical wall of air, creating a massive fatal hypothermia risk. It's a really solid hypothesis, but does the physical evidence actually back it up? Take the avalanche theory. On the surface, it makes perfect sense, right? It totally explains the sheer panic to escape the tent. But there's a huge problem. The original 1959 rescuers found absolutely 0 signs of an avalanche. No massive debris field, no swept-away trees, and the tent poles were even still somewhat intact. Plus, freezing to death in a storm definitely doesn't explain the extreme trauma we mentioned earlier, the crushed chests and the massive skull fractures. This friction between the environments and the evidence leaves room for more unconventional ideas, like the infrasound theory. Basically, this suggests that specific wind patterns whipping over the mountain created low-frequency sound waves. Have you ever walked into a totally empty room and just felt a sudden, inexplicable sense of deep dread? That's mild infrasound. Multiply that feeling by 1,000. These sound waves can allegedly trigger irrational panic and nausea in the human brain. It's an incredibly fascinating idea that perfectly explains their terrified flight, but honestly, proving an invisible atmospheric anomaly decades later is virtually impossible. We also have to talk about the historical context here. It's the 1959 Soviet Union, so the ultra-secretive atmosphere naturally fueled a ton of speculation. People quickly pointed fingers at secret parachute mines or experimental weapons testing, and the fact that the government abruptly closed the investigation only threw gasoline on that fire. But the fatal flaw in the military cover-up theory? There was an utter lack of physical weapons debris, no craters, and no definitive weapon signatures found anywhere near the site. Okay, what about foul play? Was it a criminal assault, a violent animal attack, or maybe a clash with the indigenous Mansi people? The idea is that they were attacked in the night and forced to run. Yet, the evidence stubbornly disagrees again. The snow around the tent was completely undisturbed except for the 9 hikers' footprints. Just 9 sets of prints, no animal tracks, no mysterious boots of unknown attackers. And historical records universally show the local Mansi people were completely peaceful anyway. So what invisible force were they actually running from? Let's cut through the historical fog with Section 3, Modern Scientific Research. Fast forward to 2021. Scientists decided to stop guessing and actually built a rigorous forensic model. First, they completely digitized the exact 1959 topography of the mountain. Second, they simulated the snowpack conditions under those fierce katabatic winds. And third, they modeled a highly specific, rare event known as a delayed slab avalanche, testing exactly how it would impact a tent that the hikers had manually cut into the snow slope. The results of that simulation? Absolutely groundbreaking. You see, a delayed slab avalanche doesn't look like a Hollywood movie with rolling white clouds of snow. It acts more like a solid, heavy block of concrete sliding down a very short distance. It's a sudden, silent, deadly shift of hard-packed snow. It wouldn't leave a huge debris field, but it would violently crush the tent and cause severe blunt force trauma to the people sleeping inside. So science finally gave us an empirical answer for the trauma and the panicked escape. But wait, does it actually explain everything? Not quite. Let's look at Section 4, the anomalies that remain. The slab avalanche model is fantastic for explaining the crushed ribs and skull fractures without needing a wild animal or a secret military strike. But it completely fails to explain one glaring, terrifying detail. Why were traces of abnormal beta radiation found on some of the hikers' clothing? A block of hard snow, no matter how fast it hits you, doesn't exactly carry beta radioactive isotopes, right? When you start laying out these lingering details, that neat scientific avalanche theory starts to feel strangely incomplete. We've got a missing camera from the campsite, those bizarre traces of radiation, and secondary injuries that defy the avalanche model entirely, like victims found missing their eyes, and in one case, a missing tongue. And think about this. If they were fleeing a deadly avalanche in sheer absolute terror, why did their footprints show they walked away in a highly coordinated, organized line, rather than running for their lives? Let's try to pull all of this together in Section 5, the final verdict. Here is where we currently stand. On one side, scientists widely accept the delayed slab avalanche and fatal hypothermia as the mechanical cause of death. It makes the physics of the tragedy make sense. On the other side, historians agree there was no foul play, and that extreme Soviet secrecy just heavily fueled the conspiracy theories for decades. But right there in the middle is where the true ghost of Dyatlov Pass still lives. The missing camera, the bizarre facial injuries, and the exact source of that beta radiation, completely unknown. We really have modern science to thank for stripping away so much of the supernatural myth and explaining the brutal physical reality of that mountain. But it also highlights how deeply uncomfortable we are with the unexplained. When science falls even just a little bit short, our minds rush to fill those dark gaps with monsters and conspiracies. Looking at those lingering anomalies, you just have to ask yourself, what other secrets are still buried out there in the 1959 snow? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Until next time, keep questioning the evidence.